Okay, welcome everybody to video 2. This is Mr. Schwartz, and these PowerPoint slides are concerning classical conditioning. In psychology, when we talk about learning, essentially what we're always talking about is a change in behavior. If you think about taking a test in school, you demonstrate your learning by answering questions on the test. If you got a question wrong, and then later on you got that same question right, you would have demonstrated that you learned something. But you demonstrate your learning by behaving differently on the second test compared to the first test. Other behavioral changes that can demonstrate learning can sometimes happen involuntarily. And in classical conditioning, we're going to look at the way that this type of learning was discovered accidentally. What is classical conditioning? Essentially, it's learning by associating two events that occur together in time and space. The example given here is that lightning and thunder are events that occur very close together. We associate one with the other. But we also know that lightning comes before thunder. And sometimes what happens, you will react to the lightning as if you heard thunder because you're anticipating the thunder which comes after the lightning. That's one brief example of classical conditioning. The most common example of classical conditioning is the first time classical conditioning was discovered. I told you that the picture of the bearded man on your guided notes would become familiar to you. That's a picture of Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian psychologist who essentially developed, or rather discovered, the theory of classical conditioning. He was working on examining and understanding digestive systems in animals, which is why he was studying his dog's salivation. He was measuring how much his dog salivated. What he discovered is that the dogs would begin salivating eventually before he ever gave them their food, because he would ring a bell to let his dogs know that it was time for them to eat. So eventually, ringing the bell and giving them food, eventually the bell itself produced salivation. That's classical conditioning. The dogs associated the food with the sound of the bell. So, it's always important to remember in classical conditioning, or in all real behavioral modification in any type of learning, a stimulus elicits a response. So what is a stimulus? Well, anything that elicits a response. In the classical conditioning example with Pavlov's dogs, the food is the stimulus that produces the response of salivation. Understand, there's no learning that takes place there. This is a naturally occurring reaction. In classical conditioning, we always need to have this initially naturally recurring response. So in this case, the food causes salivation. No learning has to take place in order for food to produce salivation. In this situation, we call the food the unconditioned stimulus, abbreviated US. These abbreviations and these differentiations in terms are going to be what's really important. So this slide, the next few slides, are going to be really useful to you. The unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response. It's unconditioned, meaning it's unlearned. You don't have to be conditioned in order to respond. You don't have to be conditioned to desire food in order to respond by salivating. The food, an unconditioned stimulus, produces salivation, an unconditioned response. What Pavlov did is he paired the food, the unconditioned stimulus, with what's called a neutral stimulus. In this instance was a bell. The neutral stimulus produces no response. A bell by itself, it might cause a reaction, but it's not going to produce the response of salivation. That's why in this instance the bell is the neutral stimulus. Those conditions exist before conditioning takes place, before learning happens. Conditioning is the process of learning, the process of association, the process of pairing the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So when Pavlov fed his dogs, he rang the bell and simultaneously presented the food. What would the dogs do? Well, naturally, the dogs would salivate. The unconditioned stimulus is presented with the neutral stimulus. Over time, after enough pairings, the dogs begin to mentally associate the two together. Understand here, the response is still salivation. The dogs are still responding to the food. It's just that the food is now being paired with the bell. The dog is learning to associate the bell with the food. After conditioning has taken place, after the dog has learned, after the dog has learned, the dog will begin to salivate in response to the bell. Without presenting food, the bell will cause the dogs to salivate. How do we know the dogs have learned to associate the bell with food? Because we can measure the amount of saliva that the dogs produce after the bell is introduced. After a while, the neutral stimulus now produces the response. The previously neutral stimulus is now called a conditioned stimulus. And the response that was previously unconditioned, because it was a natural response, is now called a conditioned response, because there's no natural reason why a dog would salivate to the sound of the bell unless the dog was conditioned to do so. The neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response. Okay, this slide has it all right there for you. This is going to be an important one for you to come back and reference. This is going to walk through that same process step by step, again highlighting the vocabulary that you need to know. Unconditioned stimulus automatically activates some type of physiological response. The unconditioned response is that naturally occurring reaction. Before conditioning and Pavlov's discovery, the food produced salivation. The unconditioned stimulus produced an unconditioned response. A neutral stimulus is independent. It doesn't produce a reaction by itself. The stimulus should mean nothing to the subject at first. Again, a dog might react to the sound of a bell, but they're not associating that bell with anything. The stimulus is essentially meaningless at this point. The neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus after learning has taken place. The conditioned stimulus is the former neutral stimulus, the originally unrelated stimulus that after being paired with a natural stimulus, an unconditioned stimulus, comes to produce what is now called the conditioned response. The conditioned response is a demonstration that learning has occurred. It is the learned response to the previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus paired with the unconditioned stimulus over time produces the conditioned response. Here it is again. what you're going to be asked to do next is come up with your own scenario, your own conditioning scenario. There's a lot of examples. I'll let you look through these on your own because you're going to have the PowerPoint slides available to you. And I'm going to walk you through another one of my favorite examples, another classic psychology experiment, which is the Baby Albert experiment. Baby Albert, this is a pretty cool experiment, was a little baby, like a toddler around a year old, and psychologists were testing classical conditioning. So they gave Baby Albert a stuffed animal. I think it was a stuffed rabbit as a toy. In this instance, the stuffed rabbit is the neutral stimulus. They introduced the neutral stimulus prior to introducing the unconditioned stimulus. After Baby Albert was playing with this stuffed rabbit, they would introduce the unconditioned stimulus by banging on a drum really loud, or banging on the door or the floor really loud. Obviously, that caused a reaction in Baby Albert. It caused him to get scared, and when babies get startled suddenly, they start crying. The response to the stimulus is unconditioned. The unconditioned stimulus is the loud, sudden, jarring noise. The unconditioned response is that the baby becomes startled and starts crying. The neutral stimulus, again, is the stuffed toy rabbit. Over time, what do you think happened? After enough times of Baby Albert playing with the stuffed rabbit and then being startled to the point where he becomes hysterical and starts crying, the presentation of the rabbit would cause Baby Albert to get hysterical and start crying. The baby rabbit, rather the stuffed toy rabbit, moved from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, causing the response of fear and crying in Baby Albert. It's not natural that a baby would start crying hysterically when presented with a stuffed toy rabbit. It was only because Baby Albert had learned to associate the stuffed toy rabbit with this jarring, loud, disturbing noise that caused Baby Albert to learn to be afraid of the rabbit. Okay. That's it. That's video 2. That's classical conditioning. By all means, go back, re-listen to this. Go back and refer to the slides on the PowerPoint presentation that you've been sent. And after you've completed assignment 1, your guided notes through this PowerPoint slide, go and open video number 3, which is going to walk you through assignment number 2. All right, I'll see you over at video number 3.